Hello everyone, this is Sam of Historian-splaining. A historian tells you why everything you know is wrong. These lectures are on SoundCloud, YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and other platforms. And if you can help to keep them coming, please go to my Patreon page. The link is in the description. So this will be the penultimate installment in my series on the origins of the First World War, Part 13, The July Crisis and the Outbreak of War. And this will be brought to you by the letter T. So previously in this series, I've discussed the conditions that set the stage for the beginning of this war in 1914, including the different states that were involved, ranging from the Ottoman Empire to France to Japan, and also the military conditions, the technologies, the strategies, the planning that led up to this war. And now I'm going to try to specifically look at the chain of events in June, July, and August 1914 that actually led to the beginning of this war, which has been called the July Crisis. Hopefully after this one, lastly, I'll post a final lecture discussing the real or illusory causes of this war and addressing the question of whether the First World War was inevitable. But if we look in closely at this chain of events, the sort of falling dominoes that led from the assassination of the Archduke to the actual outbreak of a Europe-wide war, there are tremendous problems just in reconstructing and distilling what happened. How did this come about? For one thing, there is no lack of sources, as historians have pointed out. Rather, there is a huge mass of documents from multiple different countries around Europe, most of which were eventually published after the war by governments who wanted to sort of put forward their point of view and, if possible, exonerate themselves of any guilt for starting this war. And these masses of thousands and thousands of documents can be culled through to really support almost any interpretation one wants. It's very confusing. And also at the same time, there are many other crucial missing documents that for some reason were intentionally left out of these volumes because they were embarrassing, or that were lost or destroyed over the course of the war, or in some cases before the war, which is especially important in the case of Serbia. For example, Apis, aka Dragutin Dmitrievich, the chief of military intelligence, who was critical in the events leading up to this war, he avoided keeping any written records and regularly burned his papers. And so hence there is a great deal of uncertainty as to who knew what and who exactly was involved in the assassination plot that eventually triggered this war. There also are questions as to what is relevant beyond these sort of state and military papers that have been collected and published. What is relevant in assessing the motives for different actors' decisions? Should we be looking at these actors simply as agents of their states, or as individuals with private motives, personalities, and proclivities? How much are their personal affairs relevant? Should we be reading their personal letters and diaries? And what about their financial ties and interests? Should we be looking through their portfolios? And even if we did, how would we know if what we find there is significant? But just to pull back with those caveats in mind, let's pull back and look at the situation as it had basically taken shape in the early years of the 20th century. And some of this is things that I've already mentioned and discussed in previous lectures about the different countries and their relationships, but some might be new. So just on the broadest level, as we've mentioned before, there was a complex system of interlocking alliances of the major powers around Europe, and to some degree others like Japan. And those alliances had shifted and reconfigured in the early years of the 20th century, such that the major powers had more or less consolidated into two main camps. Basically, you could say in response to the sudden and dramatic rise of Germany. There were those who saw a danger in the rise of Germany and sought to contain this new power. This included first and foremost France, right from the beginning, then Russia after 1890, which aligned itself closely with France, and then also Great Britain, which retrenched its foreign policy and opened up sort of friendly negotiations with both France and Russia after 1900. Then on the other hand, there was those who sought to benefit from Germany's rise by aligning themselves with Germany. Most importantly, of course, Austria-Hungary, Germany's closest ally, which joined itself to Germany after 1880. And then in a more distant and secondary way, also Italy, which entered into a secret alliance with Germany and Austria-Hungary in 1882, and the Ottoman Empire, which built up a close cooperative relationship with Germany after 1900. And then around and in between these various powers, there were neutral states such as Sweden and Belgium. So in the interrelations and interactions between these two camps, there were two main areas of tension, literally theaters of struggle and friction. One was between France and Germany in the West, which was predicated to a great degree on the territory of Alsace-Lorraine, which France still wished to take back from Germany. And then secondly, the Balkans in the East, where newly independent Balkan states such as Serbia, Romania, Bulgaria were able to play off the major powers against one another. For example, they were able to get extensive Russian support in attacking the Ottomans and seizing the province of Macedonia from the Ottoman Empire and dividing it up among themselves in the two Balkan Wars of 1912 and 13. Now, neither of these areas of friction and contestation, the Balkans and Alsace-Lorraine, neither of these necessarily meant that war would break out. That's not how most actors saw it at the time. And even as a new dispute arose in the Balkans in the summer of 1914, very few observers thought that it was going to lead to war, at least not for the first several weeks. And most of the public across Europe was paying fairly little attention to the diplomatic standoff in the Balkans. For example, as I mentioned in my lecture on France, public attention was totally absorbed by the scandalous Caillaux murder trial. And this continued to be the case until just a few days before August 3rd, when suddenly France was at war. And these observers, both in the public and also to a great degree in these national governments, they were not fools. There were valid reasons to think that war was unlikely and remote in 1914, and to continue to think so even as this crisis in the Balkans broke out. So what were some of the factors in place that militated against the possibility of war in 1914? Well, firstly, in the broadest sense, there was a system of fairly effective diplomatic procedures, which tended to maintain a balance of power among the powerful states of Europe. There were large, highly trained diplomatic corps, and a lot of the great talent of Europe was put into the foreign offices of these states. There were treaties guaranteeing neutrality of various countries and territories, including Belgium. There was an arising system of conferences, which more or less followed in the mold of the Congress of Vienna back in the 1810s, but which were smaller and more ad hoc, and often intended to diffuse particular disputes before war broke out, not after, such as the conference at Algeciras in Spain in 1906, which successfully settled the first Moroccan crisis. There also was a growing practice of third-party mediation, which became a normal and common procedure, firstly between the United States and the United Kingdom in order to settle disputes following after the Civil War. But it then caught on as an efficient procedure which could de-escalate tensions that would otherwise lead to war, and it was increasingly regularized after 1899 with the disarmament conferences. So the first disarmament conference at The Hague in 1899 created a permanent office there at The Hague with regular procedures and staff for setting up arbitration tribunals so that one didn't have to reinvent the wheel with every dispute. And then by 1910, this had become a regular and familiar part of international relations. And furthermore, the most dangerous sources of conflict outside of Europe, if we look beyond these two theaters on the Rhine in the west and the Balkans in the east, out to the wider world, which in many places was colonized and disputed among the European powers, The most dangerous sources of conflict had basically been settled by 1914. Africa had been carved up, with no real disputed zones left. The Americas were completely off the table and regarded as a sort of sphere of U.S. influence. China in the Far East had seen a system arise of coexistence between so-called spheres of influence, and the boundaries and limits of these different powers and their involvement in China had more or less been worked out. The Russian threat to British and other interests in East Asia had been beaten back by Japan with their victory over Russia in 1905. And furthermore, as many observers pointed out, there were many intertwined interests and ties of loyalty among these various states. There were deep and even strengthening ties among the royals of these various European countries, who at this time in the Belle Époque, one could say, these royals came to be revered as symbols of the past, of tradition amidst change, and they were ever more tied together by ties of marriage and by public ceremonialism. And the relationships and ties among these royals allowed for a lot of direct communication from government to government, direct meetings, letters, and telegrams. And in the eyes of many people in these sort of last years of the Belle Époque, about 1904 to 1914, in the eyes of many, this was the high watermark of royal ceremonialism. So over the course of the 19th century, there was anxiety about instability and flux, with rapid industrial and urban growth, with revolutionary movements, especially the rise of anarchist revolutionism. There was a wave of terror attacks and assassinations, especially after 1880, where you saw the Tsar of Russia, a president of Italy, a president of the United States, all being assassinated by anarchists. And there were these, as we mentioned, these shifts in the diplomatic alignments and balance of power. And in these conditions, people looked more and more to royals as representing continuity and stability, and as recourses for maintaining peace and public order. And interestingly, Barbara Tuchman, the American historian, begins her classic book, The Guns of August, from 1962, which is still probably the greatest classic book on the beginning of World War I. Tuchman begins this book by describing the funeral of the British King Edward VII after he died in 1910. And this funeral saw the attendance of 8 different sovereign monarchs, apart from the British King George V, who was Edward's successor. Apart from him, there was King Haakon VII of Norway, King Ferdinand of Bulgaria, King Manuel of Portugal, Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany, King George I of the Hellenes, King Albert of the Belgians, King Alfonso XIII of Spain, and King Frederick VIII of Denmark. Along with them, there were 7 queens, 5 heirs apparent, including the crown princes of Serbia, Romania, and Montenegro, 40 other royal highnesses, including Prince Yusuf, the son of the Ottoman Sultan, Prince Fushimi, the brother of the Emperor of Japan, Grand Duke Michael, the brother of the Tsar of Russia, the Prince Consort of Holland, and the brothers of the kings of Italy and Sweden. And most importantly of all, there was the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the nephew of the Emperor of Austria-Hungary and heir presumptive to the Habsburg throne. But the pride of place in the grand funeral procession that day in the spring of 1910 in London went to Kaiser Wilhelm II, who, in addition to being the Emperor of Germany, and hence technically the highest-ranking royal there, he also was King George's cousin. And he rode in the procession in the uniform of a British field marshal, which was his honorary rank in the British military. And it happens that Wilhelm was not entirely sad, in fact, about the passing of King Edward, who had been his uncle. He had despised Edward and seen him as unfairly opposed to German interests. He had made trips all over Europe using his considerable charm and charisma, which Wilhelm lacked, in order to build alliances against Germany and politically encircle the German nation. Wilhelm called him a Satan and condemned him for his supposed hatred of Germany. So Wilhelm was relieved, really, to see him replaced and succeeded by his son, who took the throne of Britain as George V. And George was comparatively sober and retiring. He never went to the European continent. He's quoted as saying, quote, "Abroad is bloody. I know. I've been there." And the Kaiser saw George as much more amenable to German interests. He called George a very nice boy, even though he was over 40 years old. And to President Theodore Roosevelt, Wilhelm reportedly said, quote, "He is a thorough Englishman and hates all foreigners. But I do not mind that, as long as he does not hate Germans more than other foreigners." So this much more cordial relationship between Wilhelm and George sped up the process of reconciliation and détente between the two countries. And, for example, the naval race between Britain and Germany did not entirely halt with George V's accession in 1910. He didn't have that degree of power over policy, but it did slow, and under the influence of this new relationship, it eventually came to an end. So in addition to these increasingly close and cordial relationships among the various crowned heads of Europe, among the public, there was a significant anti-war movement, which was largely grassroots, driven to a great degree by women, and it contained a large leftist factor. So many of the left-wing and socialist parties and parliaments around Europe had the ability to block war or even arms buildup in their respective parliaments, or potentially the strong union movement could even halt a war by strikes. And interestingly, in 1909, the American writer Upton Sinclair published War, a Manifesto Against It, in which he called on socialists and unions to prepare for a general strike to halt any international war. As I mentioned, there were the disarmament conferences in 1899 and another in 1907, which limited the use of weapons and created rules for the protection of neutrals and non-combatants. And another was projected to be held in 1915, in another 8 years after the 1907 conference. And this whole movement, both within governments and diplomatic corps and among the public, was influenced and promoted by anti-war theorists, such as Jan Bloch of Russia, who, as I mentioned last time, wrote Is War Now Impossible? And warned that war would now lead to trench stalemate. And there was the Briton Norman Angell, who wrote The Great Illusion, warning that great power war would simply crash the economies of all states involved, and hence would never really be feasible again. So all of these can be seen as factors at work against the possibility of any war, much less a great power war. But at the same time, there also were other factors militating in favor of the possibility of war. There was widespread and rising social Darwinism, which was influential all over Europe, but especially prevalent in Germany and Austria, and which can be seen illustrated, for instance, in the German general von Bernhardi's book, Germany and the Next War. And this philosophy presented war as a biological necessity, a process by which stronger nations would rise to the top, in a sort of clumsy analogy to the struggle for survival among creatures in nature. And this was appealing especially to Germans who had come onto the international scene later than other nations, and who often saw themselves as deprived of their rightful place as a major political and imperial power, commensurate with their industrial strength. But this is not exclusively German. These ideas could intercombine with other philosophies like Nietzsche's or Henri Bergson's, and had influence in many countries. There also is the factor that is sometimes pointed to in accounting for the outbreak of this war, which is the personal belligerence and volatility of the German Kaiser Wilhelm, who was driven by resentment and personal insecurities, a sense of grievance at being slighted by his peers and not being able to realize his or Germany's potential. For example, it is known that in 1913, Kaiser Wilhelm invited King Albert of Belgium to a banquet in Berlin, and then took Albert by surprise by saying that war between Germany and France was inevitable, and pressing King Albert to promise to take Germany's side in such a war. And this would mean abandoning Belgium's traditional policy of neutrality. And when Albert refused, Kaiser Wilhelm embarrassed himself with an angry tirade. So there are many such episodes of Wilhelm's ambition, resentment, sense of grievance, sort of overcoming his rational sense in these outbursts. But on the other hand, this can really be exaggerated. Wilhelm was also capable of getting on very well with those who he believed treated him well. As I said, in 1910, he was very happy to see the British throne pass from Edward VII to George V, and he adored George V, and their rapport improved relations between their nations. Now, regardless, the Kaiser's actual power over German policy was very restrained, especially after about 1911, when the Kaiser went into a sort of semi-retirement. And his actual influence was put to the test in the Zavern affair, the controversy over German military officials' treatment of civilians in Alsace-Lorraine, which flared up also in the spring of 1914. And in this affair, the Kaiser remained mainly passive, and the more conciliatory forces in the government and the Reichstag ended up winning out, and thus confirming civilian control and parliamentary supremacy over the military. There was still, of course, the factor of inter-imperial conflict and contestation over colonies, especially in Africa, but that had been basically diffused between about 1898 and 1912. There was the struggle over control and spheres of influence in the Balkans, which was alive and arguably escalating. So there was a succession of wars over Ottoman territory, which we've mentioned, Italy's invasion and capture of Libya in 1911-12, the two Balkan Wars in 1912-13, in which a League of Balkan states with Russian support took the province of Macedonia. And also all through this time, from about 1907 to 1914, there was a looming and accelerating naval arms race between the Ottoman Empire and Greece. And it stemmed originally from a dispute over control of islands in the northern Aegean Sea, near the Straits of the Dardanelles, which in turn led to the Bosporus, the city of Constantinople, and the Black Sea. And Greece began to seriously challenge the Ottomans at sea, leading to small standoffs and skirmishes that seemed as if they might lead to war. In 1911, the Ottomans took out enormous loans in order to pay for two dreadnought battleships, the true state-of-the-art of that time, which they ordered from the British firm Vickers, and which were worked on for the next 3 years. And this attracted a great deal of attention and concern, especially from Russia. So the Russians, for their part, were afraid that if a war did break out in the Aegean between Greece and the Ottomans, it might lead to the closing off of shipping through the straits that connected the Aegean to the Black Sea. And this was really a huge danger to the Russians because those straits were a vital link through which they exported grain, their main export, to the West. So it was economically and strategically crucial to them. And even if it did not lead to a war, nonetheless, the Ottomans, it seemed, would still come out of this arms race with a larger and more powerful navy on the Black Sea, even than the Russians. And so the Russians believed that this could lead to a repeat of the Crimean War, in which the Ottomans and their allies together had defeated Russia on the Black Sea, or even a repeat of the Russo-Japanese War, in which a well-equipped new navy had defeated them. So there was a mood of fear and tension in which especially Russian leaders were not totally averse to the idea of going into a war against the Ottomans before those dreadnoughts and other state-of-the-art ships and weapons could be delivered to Constantinople. There also was, as we know, the high tension between Austria-Hungary and Serbia in the Western Balkans. And there were elements within the Serbian state, led most of all by the Black Hand secret society, that were actively supporting incitement, sabotage, and assassinations in Austro-Hungarian territory, especially in Bosnia, in large part working through underground radical nationalist and anarchist networks, and especially through the ostensibly licit Serbian nationalist organization called Narodna Odbrana. So this particular problem of the tension and underground hostilities between Serbia and Austria-Hungary, this problem was widely known at the time in Europe, and it is often spoken of and cited today, because in retrospect we know of the role that this conflict played in touching off the First World War. But also it is important to understand how did this particular problem with a much smaller neighboring state of Serbia, how did it lead to this massive international war? And in order to reconstruct that, we have to first understand the internal dynamics in Austria-Hungary in order to see how this particular power struggle, and not the one involving the Ottomans, is the one that actually led to war. So how did the government of Austria-Hungary work, and how were they making decisions about military and foreign affairs in the 1910s leading up to this war? This is the most crucial country to understand in order to grasp what happened in the July crisis. So the Austro-Hungarian regime was highly complicated, ambiguous, and opaque. It was in many respects an outdated Byzantine system, still in a slow and uneven process of reform. So internal powers within the Austro-Hungarian state were divided, for one thing between Austria and Hungary, each of which had control over its own internal affairs, and between which there were many deep divergences. Foreign policy ostensibly was created by a set of interlocking networks, including the Foreign Ministry, the Military General Staff, the Military Chancellery, the major embassies, and even others. And major policy changes had to be signed off on both by the emperor and by both of the prime ministers of Austria and Hungary. So this whole process was very ambiguous, and not surprisingly, feuding camps formed within this complex network. The main divisions in the Austro-Hungarian foreign policy machinery, if you can even call it that, the main divisions were over the stance towards Austria-Hungary's rivals, Italy, Serbia, and others. There was a camp that was more belligerent and another that was more conciliatory. And positions on internal matters within the empire largely flowed from that division over foreign policy. Now, in the middle of all of this, there was the emperor, who was old. He was now over 80 years of age and very resistant to change. In the 1900s, he became more and more passive. He vetoed ideas that he did not like, but did not chart new paths of his own. And increasingly he ceded initiative to others in the government who filled the power vacuum. And this allowed for a large field of opportunity for strong personalities with clear visions. So around the emperor, there were three main leading figures, each with his own power base and political camp supporting him. Firstly, there was, as we know, Franz Ferdinand, the emperor's nephew and heir, who did not get on personally with the emperor. Franz Josef, it seems, was still bitter over the death of his own son, the Prince Rudolf, back in 1889, and it took Franz Josef years to even formally confirm Franz Ferdinand as his heir. He also was bitter and resentful over Franz Ferdinand's marriage, which the emperor saw as too low in status and not good for the empire. There also was deep disagreement between the emperor and Franz Ferdinand over the dual monarchy system. Franz Ferdinand saw it as an obstacle to reform and modernization. He resented the often obstructive power of the Magyar elite that controlled Hungary. But Franz Josef, for his part, saw it as a major accomplishment and legacy of his reign, and he was very resistant to any change in the dual monarchy system. Hence, for these reasons, largely because of his alienation from the emperor, the heir presumptive Franz Ferdinand created a sort of court in exile of his own, making his own plans in anticipation of taking up the throne. And Franz Ferdinand was given a portfolio as the inspector of the army, something that could have just been minor and pro forma, ceremonial. But he took it very seriously, and he took control of the military chancellery, making it into his own sort of policy think tank. On the foreign front, he favored conciliation with neighboring powers, partly due to the value that he placed on peace, but also because he believed that the army needed to be kept at home in order to keep domestic order and unity within the empire, and also partly as a way of buying time. So he believed that Austria-Hungary was not yet ready to fight their rivals in the Balkans, and most especially was not ready to face off against Russia. And they needed more time to build up infrastructure and to modernize and rearm the military, as well as he hoped to build up a navy on the Adriatic. So the biggest obstacle to these goals that Franz Ferdinand wanted to achieve was the Magyar elite that, as I said, controlled the government of Hungary. And these tended to block new taxes and reforms, deny resources to the army ministry, and to rule Hungary with fairly repressive policies, especially against the non-Magyar ethnic groups, thus creating discontent and restiveness among the minorities, especially Slavic minority groups, and to create, in Franz Ferdinand's view, then a danger of infiltration by Eastern powers and fragmentation of the empire. The Magyars, in his view, also had an inordinate share of power in the imperial government, and Franz Ferdinand was determined to undercut the power of the Magyar oligarchs in Vienna. So Franz Ferdinand planned first to create a third Slavic kingdom, initially perhaps in Bohemia, and then later more likely based in the south, in the sort of South Slav area that could prospectively be called Yugoslavia, the South Slav land. And this, he believed, would weaken the Hungarian elite, dilute their power, and also mollify the Slavic national movements, giving them an arena to realize their national aspirations within the Habsburg Empire. As time went on, after about 1910 or so, his thinking actually shifted further, and he went beyond this trialism idea of three kingdoms towards an even more radical plan to break the empire into not only 3, but 9 or 10 smaller constituent commonwealths, thus making the empire into a kind of United States of Central Europe. And only the imperial ministries in Vienna then would have enough clout to direct foreign policy. So while Franz Ferdinand was sort of cooking up these various ideas in the military chancellery, one of his few actual substantive powers was in determining appointments to major offices in the military and foreign service. And very significantly, in 1906, Franz Ferdinand successfully engineered the appointment of a new chief of staff for the military general staff, and that was Franz Conrad von Hötzendorf, who then became the sort of second major figure in the Austro-Hungarian government, competing for power and control. So Franz Conrad von Hötzendorf was a longtime army officer. When he was appointed, he was 54 years old, and he agreed on the need for extensive reform, including the extension of more rights and freedoms to minorities, and the pensioning off and replacement of old military officers. Also, part of why Franz Ferdinand liked Conrad and got him appointed was that Conrad was kind and respectful to Franz Ferdinand's wife, and that was very important to him. But Conrad came from the sort of romantic school of warfare that was coming to the fore in the 1900s. He was devoted to the cult of the offensive, and ironically, he became Franz Ferdinand's main nemesis within the government. He constantly advocated for preemptive war against Austria-Hungary's enemies, including Serbia, Montenegro, Romania, Russia, and even Italy, which was technically their ally. In 1907, he openly called for the annexation of Serbia to the empire, and he described Serbia as, quote, a breeding ground for those aspirations and machinations that aim at the separation of the South Slav areas. And these very aggressive policy stances reflected the general's temperament. So in his personal life, as well as in office, he was similarly obsessive, volatile, and reckless. He had many bouts of depression, especially after the death of his wife in 1905, and he spent a lot of time on long trips in the mountains, drawing and writing, often saying that he longed to die. In 1907, he went to a dinner party and met the Italian-born society matron Virginia Gina von Reininghaus. And he fell madly in love with her, soon saying, quote, I am terribly in love with you and have only one thought in my head, that you should become my wife. In response, she had to remind him that she was married with 6 children. And he said, nevertheless, I will not rest. This will be my North Star. Over the next 8 years, Conrad wrote over 3,000 love letters to Gina. That means more than one per day. Some of them ran as long as 60 pages. The main theme of them was that she was his only joy in life. The vast bulk of these love letters were never sent so as to avoid attracting attention and scandal. So instead, Conrad collected them into a massive tome, which he called The Diary of My Sufferings, and which was only found after his death. But partly because of his letters to Gina, we know about his urgent desire for war. For instance, in the spring of 1909, during a lingering diplomatic feud with Serbia over the Bosnian annexation, Conrad wrote, quote, "It is a crime that nothing is being done. War against Serbia could have saved the monarchy. In a few years we shall atone bitterly for this omission, and I shall be chosen to bear the entire responsibility and drain the chalice to its dregs." End quote. So you can see here a peculiar combination of impetuousness and self-pity. And it seems that Conrad's private affair and his political stances were connected. He believed he could only engineer Gina's divorce from her husband and remarriage to him if he had the opportunity to go to war and come back home as a war hero. So he had very private, even secret motives for his policy agenda. But he had tremendous authority and influence. He was able to build a war party based mainly in the general staff, and he persistently criticized and undermined the foreign minister Aehrenthal, with whom he feuded over the issue of Italy. So Aehrenthal wanted conciliation and to build an alliance with Italy, whereas Conrad wanted to go to war. So the Emperor Franz Joseph at certain points warned Conrad to shut up and respect the foreign minister, but nonetheless he persisted. In 1911, the emperor dismissed him from office, partly on the pretext of his affair with Gina, which was increasingly openly known. But nonetheless, the following year in 1912, after the First Balkan War broke out and threatened the stability of all of Eastern Europe, the emperor brought Conrad back into the general staff, along with a new foreign minister, and that was Count Leopold Berchtold. So that's the third person we have to be aware of in this situation. So Leopold Berchtold was arguably caught between the two, right? Between Franz Ferdinand on the one hand and Konrad von Hötzendorf on the other. And Berchtold was a longtime diplomat from an aristocratic background. He generally disliked politics and served out of duty. He preferred a more conciliatory path like Franz Ferdinand. He had served for many years as ambassador to Russia before becoming foreign minister, and he wanted to maintain peaceable relations with Russia and stability in the Balkans. And he was present in St. Petersburg at the time when Austria-Hungary annexed Bosnia, causing great outrage in St. Petersburg. And he was able to mostly smooth things over, but he worried that there was still lingering resentment and distrust towards them in Russia. And he believed he did not have the charm and finesse to really fix this situation. So he was happy to be recalled and go back to Vienna. He then was appointed as foreign minister in 1912 and was immediately then thrown into a crisis with the First Balkan War breaking out. And this was really alarming to him because, firstly, it showed that these new states were able to act in concert and take on a large enemy. And this time, of course, it was the Ottomans, but who knows if next time it might be Austria-Hungary. Also, more immediately, it showed that Serbia was a force to be reckoned with. So Serbia surprised the world with its effectiveness in this First Balkan War. It gained massively in territory and population, and in particular, Serbia now occupied northern Albania, which included territory that could give them sea access, and by extension could give sea access to Russia as well, directly to the Mediterranean. So in response, Austria-Hungary, along with Britain, pressed Serbia to give up control of most of northern Albania. But nonetheless, Serbia still tried to hang on to a strip of land leading to the sea, and it now occupied large areas including various ethnic groups, many of whom did not accept Serbian rule. The following year, in 1913, Berchtold received many reports of atrocities, with Serbian troops massacring hundreds of Albanians and wiping out and torching several small villages in Macedonia. So this mounting crisis and alarm was then compounded later in 1913 with the exposure of the spy Alfred Radel, who, as I mentioned before, was for a long time had been passing secret information and war plans from Austria-Hungary to Russia. And this created a whole other crisis for both the military and the foreign ministry. And it was further compounded when Radel killed himself before he could be interrogated. And as it turned out, Radel had actually been helped in this act by none other than Franz Conrad von Hötzendorf, the chief of the general staff, who had sent officers to supply Radel with a pistol and then left him alone with it, giving him an opportunity to commit suicide. And why did Conrad do this? Probably because he knew that many other informants in Vienna had also been passing information to Russia. Some of them had been his own protégés, including his own son's close friend. And so he was concerned with the embarrassment, both to him and to the government, if Radel had actually been effectively interrogated and deposed. But nonetheless, of course, this act of helping Radel to end his own life created a further rift and distrust between Conrad and Berchtold. Now, a year later, in the spring of 1914, Berchtold finally was able to enjoy some respite from this constant crisis. The Serbians sought conciliation with Austria-Hungary. They pulled their troops out of northern Albania and stopped incursions into the Albanian territory. And war seemed highly unlikely. Serbia was largely exhausted from 2 wars and was distracted and stretched trying to manage this territory that they had captured. But still there was a lingering sense of distrust and contempt stemming from the massacres in the Balkans. And the Austrian minister in Belgrade described Serbia as a country where, quote, murder and killing have been raised to a system. In June 1914, Berchtold commissioned a private memorandum in order to sum up Austria-Hungary's situation in the Balkans. This memorandum warned that the Balkan coalition, having won almost everything that they wanted against the Ottomans, would naturally turn next towards the obvious target of Austria-Hungary. The good news was that Serbia seemed to be quiescent for the time being, and the opinions in Romania and Bulgaria had soured somewhat on Russia. So this apparent or phantasmic next Balkan coalition maybe couldn't be organized. The memorandum advised that Austria-Hungary should aggressively pursue an alliance with Bulgaria and should work together with the Germans and persuade them to back their position more firmly and to impress upon them the need to hold the line in the Balkans against an aggressive Russia. Now, there was no time for the Austro-Hungarian government to actually implement any of this before, on June 28th, the Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie traveled to Sarajevo, ostensibly to review the Bosnian troops and to attend the opening of a museum. And as we've mentioned before, this date of June 28th was very significant for 2 reasons. For one, it was Franz Ferdinand and Sophie's 14th wedding anniversary, and it allowed them to take part in public celebrations together, which was forbidden in Vienna because it was a morganatic marriage and Sophie was considered too low status. Also, it was St. Vitus Day, which was the traditional day for commemoration of the Battle of Kosovo, the legendary massive battle in 1389 that was so central to Serbian national mythology. Franz Ferdinand had been warned that this was a bad day to go to Sarajevo, but went anyway. And exactly what happened on that day in Sarajevo, I've described previously, blow by blow, in part 4 on Bosnia and the Assassination. But just to recapitulate in brief, both Franz Ferdinand and Sophie were assassinated by Bosnian Serb militants who had been armed and trained by Serbian government officials in Belgrade. So in the last days of June, starting even the evening after the murders, this incident was reported all over Europe and even in the United States as a shocking and cataclysmic event. Many people in years later recalled the exact moment of receiving the news by telephone or newspaper or posted flyer, by word of mouth, announced in restaurants or on the streets. And it was remembered much like many Americans recall the assassination of JFK and how they first heard of that disaster in 1963. And many observers, especially in governments such as British MPs, immediately recognized the significance and the danger that stemmed from this assassination. It was, of course, especially decried in Austria. There was extensive disbelief in Vienna until special editions of the newspapers came out that evening. and many of them reported Franz Ferdinand's last words to his wife, "Don't die, Sophie, stay alive for our children." So Franz Ferdinand had not been very popular among the public. He tended to be seen as aloof, officious, and unpleasant. There was no great outpouring of grief for him personally, but nonetheless the murder of both the husband and wife elicited a degree of sympathy and added to the sense of outrage, especially in Austria-Hungary. And the anger of Austro-Hungarian subjects was further inflamed by reports of celebrations and jubilation in Belgrade, in the Serbian press, and even in the fields of Kosovo, where Serb nationalists were holding a festival in honor of the anniversary of the Battle of Kosovo. The Serbian Prime Minister Pasic tried to discourage these expressions of jubilation, but he had little control over them. And in response, the Austrian public raised a hue and a cry. There were anti-Serbian demonstrations in the cities, attracting many Austrians as well as Croats, and demanding that the assassination must be investigated to find the involvement of the Serbian state and to hold Serbia accountable. So meanwhile, the investigation into the murders began immediately. Just minutes after the assassination, the actual shooter, Gavrilo Princip, was arrested on the street. And then shortly later that day, his co-conspirator Chabrinovic, who had thrown a bomb at the motorcade, was also arrested. At first, both Princip and Chabrinovic denied working together at all. But the authorities soon found that the bombs and guns that the assassins had used were all Serbian. Soon after, the two prisoners admitted that they had conspired together, but they insisted that it was their own idea. They had gotten the weapons of their own accord and on their own initiative in Belgrade from a Bosnian militant named Ciganovic, who had been born in Bosnia and had no known links to the Serbian government, but who was active in Narodna Odbrana. Now, we know that this was an intentional red herring. None of this story was true. And in fact, the two prisoners had cooked up and shared this cover story between them because they were put in adjacent cells in the jail in Sarajevo, and they were able to communicate through knocking on the walls. And in this way, using a code, were able to match up their stories. The following day, June 29th, a third assassin was arrested, named Danilo Ilic. He revealed that all three of them, were part of a team of 7 assassins who had been recruited from among the radical Bosnian Serb students. And they were armed and supported by a large network of spies and smugglers, and supplied and supported by a man named Major Voja Tonkosic, who was a Serbian officer and an assistant to the head of military intelligence, Dmitrijevic. So by fingering Tonkosic, in fact, the prisoners were getting quite close to the actual head of the Black Hand, Dmitrijevic, also called Apis. Ilic also gave the names of 3 more conspirators, 2 of whom the Austro-Hungarian authorities were able to locate and arrest. After this point, the investigation stalled, and for 2 weeks in July, the various other assassins who'd been arrested kept their mouths shut or gave only partial and false information. Evidently, they were determined to protect their allies in Belgrade. The Austrian police very much wanted to tie the conspiracy to Apis, but they got nowhere. So as the investigation dragged, a new Balkan crisis emerged. So for one thing, the war party gained total control in Vienna. The conciliatory party, which had been based at the military chancellery, had been both humiliated and effectively decapitated by the assassination of Franz Ferdinand. The military chief of staff, Konrad von Hötzendorf, leapt at the opportunity to call for an attack on Serbia, and his constant refrain reportedly was, "War, war, war." Also, the governor of Bosnia, Potiorek, felt responsible and feared that if Serbian infiltration continued, Bosnia would become ungovernable and fall into civil war. Crucially, the finance minister Leon Bilinski, who had long favored conciliation and coexistence with the Slavs, he himself happened to be Polish by birth, Bilinski was so shocked by the assassinations, he felt that the empire must strike back hard and decisively. Most high-level officials in the foreign ministry were also horrified by the assassination and saw a danger of the Slavic zones of the empire disintegrating or of Russia extending its sphere of influence and effectively taking over the Balkans. And so they gravitated toward Conrad's and Potiorek's position, insisting on war. So by June 30th, the foreign minister Berchtold was left isolated, surrounded by war hawks. These war advocates argued that the current disaster had happened because Berchtold had been so soft and passive and had demurred from joining into the two Balkan wars in 1912 and 13. So on the evening of the 30th, Berchtold met with the emperor, who reportedly was surprisingly sad and who talked a great deal about the deaths of Franz Ferdinand and Sophie and at one point teared up. So although they had not been great pals, nonetheless he was aggrieved and moved by the murders. Berchtold insisted that they must take a hard line with Serbia and punish them for this crime, and the emperor agreed, giving only the caveat that any move towards war would have to be approved by the Hungarian Prime Minister Tija. So in consultations, Tija, the Prime Minister of Hungary, opposed going to war. He had hated Franz Ferdinand and feared his plans to further subdivide Hungary for the benefit of the Slavs. And he feared that if they went to war in the Balkans, Romania might attack Hungary from the east and incite rebellion among the Romanians in Hungary. He was not completely closed to the possibility of war, but he insisted that first the investigation must be completed and Belgrade must be shown to be responsible. There had to at least be that reasonable pretext. By the first week of July, all the surviving assassins but one had been apprehended, and the paths clearly led back to Belgrade, but it still had not been ascertained whether the Serbian state was involved or how. So in this sort of suspended state of ambiguity and uncertainty, different countries around Europe had to respond in different ways, and the reactions were widely varying. The most sympathetic, not surprisingly, was Germany, where the assassination was taken extremely seriously. The Kaiser had been a personal friend of Franz Ferdinand, identified with his ambition and his reformism, and the Kaiser was informed of the murders on the evening of the 28th when he was on his yacht at Kiel, a port on the Baltic, and he immediately left his yacht and headed back to Berlin. But the Kaiser also wanted to avoid unnecessary conflict and to keep the situation in hand. Beyond the Kaiser, there was significant public feeling of sympathy, especially for the elderly Austrian Emperor Franz Josef, who was now 83 years old, a widower, and now with no heirs. There also was sympathy in several other smaller countries that had seen Franz Ferdinand as an advocate and sympathizer with the rights of minorities, most especially Romania. The countries that were much more indifferent included, firstly, Serbia, obviously, which wanted to downplay the whole thing and avoid any imputation of guilt. Italy, where there was some recognition of the crime, but also some celebration. For instance, in theaters, bands played the national anthem. There was Russia, which dismissed the idea that the crime in any way implicated the Serbian state. And also, very significantly, France. So France at this time was torn by internal partisan wrangling and was paying fairly little attention to events in Eastern Europe. On the 28th, the day of the assassinations, a courier actually brought the news to the president of France, Poincaré, who at the time was at the Longchamp racetrack with several ministers and diplomats watching the horse races. And when the news was brought, the Austro-Hungarian ambassador immediately withdrew, but the rest, including the president, stayed to keep watching the races. And later in July, the headlines in France were completely taken up by the Caillaux scandal, with the trial set to begin on July 20th. Now, the most ambivalent nation, as distinct from indifferent, the most torn, you could say, was Great Britain. So there was no great love for Franz Ferdinand or Austria-Hungary in Great Britain, but they were sympathetic to the fear of anarchism and disorder. Britons were widely frightened by the mounting unrest over Irish Home Rule and the suffragette bombing campaign, and the British government took a careful line, arguing that thorough investigations must be undertaken, but war avoided. And this was in line with Britain's traditional role and self-image as an impartial broker, even as they were actually effectively aligned with the Serbs against Austria-Hungary in the diplomatic landscape. Now, the Serbs assured Austrian diplomats that they would help in investigating the murders. For example, on July 3rd, the Prime Minister Pasic himself, at a memorial mass in Belgrade, told the Austro-Hungarian ambassador that they would treat the crime, quote, the same as if it had been one of our own rulers. But that promise arguably rang hollow, considering the history of Serbian radicals assassinating their own kings. This had happened repeatedly in the 19th century, and so some Austro-Hungarians took this as a kind of veiled insult. The Serbs also launched no separate investigation of their own, except at one point the Belgrade chief of police was asked to look into the assassins' links to Belgrade, and he soon made a report finding no links at all, and even denying that such a person as Tsiganovic even existed. And after that, the Serbian government considered the matter closed. Now, what about the greater power to the east, Russia? Well, Russian diplomats at the same time developed a counter-narrative, which they then circulated through diplomatic channels and leaked to the press. And this narrative argued that this was entirely an internal Austro-Hungarian matter. The assassins were indeed all from within Bosnia, not Serbia proper. They had operated within Bosnia. There was no involvement of the Serb government, according to the Russian point of view. And the Russians emphasized that the assassins were young radical anarchists in order to downplay their connection to Serbian nationalism and irredentism. And especially as the Austrian investigation in Bosnia stalled, the Russians insisted that there was no evidence of Serbian involvement, which even at that point the Russians knew was not true. They also leaked to the press reports that Serbia had forewarned Austria-Hungary about the plot against Franz Ferdinand, but these warnings had been ignored. And finally, they argued that it was extremely dangerous for Austria-Hungary to force Serbia, an independent sovereign state, to open their records or their sovereign territory to cooperate in investigating a crime that was committed by Austro-Hungarian subjects against Austro-Hungarian subjects in Austro-Hungarian territory. And the Russians argued that this incident was clearly being exploited by the Habsburg regime in order to further their own territorial ambitions and to try to crush and annex a neighboring sovereign state. So the Austrians, seeing these different reactions, and especially this Russian counter-narrative, the Austrians were infuriated and insulted. They pointed out the glaring contradictions in the Russian story. For instance, if the Serbs had in fact forewarned them, then that means that the Serbian government had foreknowledge of the plot, and how could they have known if they were not involved or at least complicit? But nonetheless, the Russians and the Serbians didn't budge from their position. And by July 3rd, the Austro-Hungarians concluded that Belgrade would not cooperate or take the matter seriously without some outside coercion. So then the next looming question was, would Austria-Hungary's main ally, Germany, step in and use their diplomatic clout? So Germany, in the first few days, their diplomats advised caution. They discouraged Austria-Hungary from making any humiliating demands on Serbia. The Austrians knew that this reflected the attitude of Kaiser Wilhelm, who wanted to stay out of the Balkans and avoid any needless conflicts with Russia. So the Austro-Hungarians decided that they should draw upon the cordial personal relationship between the two emperors, and they hoped that Franz Josef could talk directly with Kaiser Wilhelm and persuade him of the need for action when the Kaiser came to Vienna for the funeral of Franz Ferdinand. But the Kaiser's trip to Vienna was cancelled due to signs and clues pointing towards another possible assassination plot against him. So instead, on July 4th, the Austro-Hungarians sent a diplomat, Alexander de Hoyos, to Berlin with 2 sealed documents to present to the Kaiser and the German Chancellor. The first one was a memorandum describing the mounting dangers in the Balkans, including the rising threat of Romania backed by Russia. And it ended by insisting that the eagle of Austria-Hungary, quote, must now tear with resolute hand the threads that its enemies are weaving into a net over its head. Then as for the personal note to the Kaiser, this insisted that war with Serbia was necessary and inevitable. It was needed in order to, quote, eliminate Serbia as a power factor in the Balkans. And it said that the assassination was part of, quote, a well-organized conspiracy whose threads lead back to Belgrade. And it closed finally by saying to the Kaiser, quote, you too will be convinced after the recent terrible events in Bosnia that there can be no further question of bridging by conciliation the difference that separates Serbia from us, and that the policy pursued by all European monarchs of preserving the peace will be at risk for as long as this hotbed of criminal agitation in Belgrade remains unpunished, end quote. So you can see how this note called upon Wilhelm's duty as a monarch and invoked a kind of fellowship or alliance of kings that was supposed to ensure stability and peace. So on July 5th, Hoyos arrived at Berlin and he met with the Undersecretary of State, Zimmermann, and he also handed off the two documents to the Austro-Hungarian ambassador at Berlin, Jegényi, who then had lunch with the Kaiser at the Neues Palais, the imperial palace at Potsdam. And both of these men, Zimmermann and the Kaiser, gave generally friendly receptions to these diplomats from Austria-Hungary, and they agreed that some action against Serbia was necessary. The ambassador, meeting with the Kaiser, asked whether Germany would support them. The Kaiser at first demurred, saying he would have to talk to his advisors. Then, after the break for lunch, the ambassador pressed the question again. And finally, the Kaiser gave in and pledged support to Austria. Also, both Kaiser Wilhelm and Zimmermann, the foreign secretary, insisted that Russia was in no condition to go to war. Although their military had been improved, it still was far behind Germany's, and so Russia would hold back from intervening with force of arms. The next day, July 6th, the Kaiser left, going on a yachting holiday to Norway. Before leaving, he told the Secretary of the Navy that this crisis would not lead to war. Russia, he said, will never take the side of regicides. And this, it seems, was a common view in the German government. The Serbs, in their view, were infamous regicides. One can think back to the assassinations I mentioned, and also the 1903 coup, in which the Black Hand had overthrown and murdered the king and queen in 1903. So, in their view, Russia, of all countries, would never go to the mat to defend Serbs. Now, Hoyos and Jegényi met with the German Chancellor, Bethmann Hollweg, and the Chancellor gave them a formal assurance on behalf of Germany. According to the cables that these diplomats sent back to Vienna, the German Chancellor said to them, quote, "It was the view of the German government that we must judge what ought to be done to sort out this relationship. Whatever our decision turned out to be, we could be confident that Germany as our ally and a friend of the monarchy would stand behind us." End quote. So you can see here there was no explicit reference to war, not that we can see in the written record, although it was fairly clearly implied. Also, this whole communique makes no mention of Russia. It doesn't seem as if anyone on any side here thought that it was necessary to address the possibility of Russia supporting Serbia. From the next day, July 7th onward, the German Kaiser was away, cruising around Norway and listening to shipboard lectures about the U.S. Civil War. The Kaiser also encouraged other leaders, such as the Minister of War, to also go away on holiday. The Chief of Staff, Helmut von Moltke the Younger, went to take the waters at Carlsbad in Bohemia for 2 weeks. And this served to show to all of Europe that the Germans were not worried, and that they were confident that the whole situation would be worked out quickly, and that the Serbs would capitulate to any reasonable demands. Now, what about in Vienna? In Austria-Hungary, there was a general conviction that the situation must lead to war, and some, such as Konrad von Hötzendorf, had wanted to attack right away, but there were some reasons for restraint or delay. For one thing, there were delays and dead ends in the murder investigation. Secondly, there was a lack of consensus on strategy. The Hungarian Prime Minister Tija's opposition to an immediate attack, which was due partly to fear that Romania might counterattack in Transylvania, and so Tija wanted to shore up the diplomatic alliances with the Bulgarians and the Ottomans. But there was an unclear endgame as well. Even if Austria-Hungary did attack Serbia and win, what would they do with Serbia after the war? Would it be annexed, broken up, left in place? There was the long delay in mobilizing the army. It couldn't be done completely for more than 2 weeks. And since a portion of the Austro-Hungarian troops were actually away on harvest leave, harvesting grain on their farms, they wouldn't come back until July 25th. So there was a tremendous lag time in being able to mobilize an army and put it in the field. There also was widespread worry about Austria-Hungary appearing as the aggressor and the feeling of a need for a good rationale justifying an attack on Serbia. So eventually an agreement was hammered out on July 8th and 9th, which held that the Austro-Hungarians would formulate an ultimatum to give to the Serbians, which would comprise a list of demands relating to the assassination and cross-border agitation. And this ultimatum would be calculated to be too harsh and extreme for Serbia to accept. But when rejected, it would also give a pretext then for attack, for what they euphemistically called a military solution. So the Austro-Hungarian principals agreed that they should meet again on July 19th in order to draft their demands. And then still further after that, they would still delay and not actually deliver the ultimatum to Serbia until July 23rd. And there were several reasons for this. One is, as we mentioned, it would take a long time to mobilize the army anyway, and also because the French president, Raymond Poincaré, and the French Prime Minister, Viviani, were scheduled to visit St. Petersburg and to confer with the Tsar and his ministers beginning on July 20th. So if the ultimatum to Serbia were to come to light during that visit, when these French leaders were in St. Petersburg, it would then give the Entente powers, France and Russia, time and a chance to confer on their response, and perhaps even to agree to take military counteraction. And Austria-Hungary, as you can see here, was much more alive to the real danger of Russian intervention than the Germans were. So the Austro-Hungarian leaders agreed that they would work out the demands, compile them, and prepare to deliver them, all in deep secrecy. Meanwhile, they would order the Austro-Hungarian press to stop talking about Serbia in order to maintain an appearance of calm and to reassure the Russians that all would be well. But the Russians learned from 2 leaks, one in Berlin on July 11th and another in Vienna on July 16th. The Russians learned that the Austro-Hungarians were drawing up a list of demands to place upon Belgrade, which were, quote, unacceptable to any independent state, as some Russians put it. So a message containing this leaked information was sent to the Tsar himself, who then hand-wrote in a comment on the document, saying, quote, in my view, no country can present demands to another unless it has resolved to go to war. So by this point, Serbia also already knows that this ultimatum is coming, and they internally resolve to reject the demands, even though they don't even know yet what all of them are. Austria-Hungary was infuriated by these leaks that had blown their cover, and they blamed the Germans. And so in response, they cut off communications with Berlin. And from this point onward, the German leadership did not know directly what was going on inside Vienna for the rest of July. On July 16th, the French warship the France embarked from Dunkirk, carrying on board the French president Raymond Poincaré, the Prime Minister René Viviani, and the political director of the Foreign Office named Margaret. The ship took 4 days to sail around Denmark and eastward across the Baltic. Along the way, the president had to give tutorials on foreign relations to the Prime Minister Viviani, who was new and inexperienced. He'd only been in office for 4 weeks. On July 20th, they sailed into the harbor of Kronstadt, an island just outside of St. Petersburg. They were greeted there directly by the Tsar Nicholas and were taken onto the imperial yacht, the Alexandria. On this boat, the direct discussions began right away between the Tsar and the president. Both of them insisted that the alliance between France and Russia must be strongly reaffirmed and that they must not budge or show weakness in dealings with Germany. The Tsar asked for help in diffusing tensions with Great Britain in Persia, and ultimately in bringing Britain firmly into their alliance, what was now called the Triple Entente, but which was still really a loose, unofficial arrangement. The president, the prime minister, and the Tsar then went ashore and slept that night at the palace of Peterhof outside St. Petersburg. The next day, on the 21st, after clearing up some small minor issues, they then turned to the pressing matter of Serbia and Austria-Hungary. The president saw that this was the Tsar's, quote, most vivid preoccupation. The Tsar reportedly told the president, quote, the alliance between our two governments appears more necessary than ever. In the afternoon of that day, Poincaré and Viviani held a reception for various ambassadors at the palace. Poincaré questioned the Austro-Hungarian ambassador about the assassination investigation, and he preemptively expressed skepticism about any findings that the Austro-Hungarians might report, and he warned them against making any demands on Serbia. In his words, he said, quote, Serbia has friends in Europe who would be astonished by an action of this kind. Over the next 2 days, July 22nd and 23rd, there was reportedly an increasing atmosphere of militancy at Peterhof. A military review was held involving 70,000 men. Banquets were held where the bands played French military marches, prominently including the Marche Lorraine, which was a reference to that lost province in Western Europe that France wished to regain from Germany. And the bands reportedly broke with normal custom by wearing their combat uniforms while performing. Also, the Archduchess Anastasia, who had been born as a princess in Montenegro and was the Tsar's sister-in-law, she had the tables at these banquets decked out with Lorraine thistles, which she had gathered from hills in secret missions across the border in Germany. And moreover, she boasted openly that there was going to be a war. She told the French, "You will have Alsace-Lorraine back. Our armies will meet in Berlin, and Germany and Austria will be destroyed." In this highly charged atmosphere, the French Prime Minister Viviani was overwhelmed and went into an apparent breakdown, pacing and muttering and eventually becoming unresponsive. On the evening of the 23rd, before the French officials left, Poincaré urged Tsar Nicholas to remain firm with Austria, recalling the long-standing policy of fermeté, which the French had repeatedly advocated. The Prime Minister Viviani reportedly regained his composure, and together with Russian officials, he composed a short press release saying that the two countries were in total agreement about the European balance of power, including in the Balkans, in a sort of thinly veiled reference to this Serbian crisis. The Russian press took this statement and ran with it and began openly calling for military action in defense of Serbia's independence. Meanwhile, at the same time, on the morning of the 23rd, the Austro-Hungarian minister in Belgrade, named Baron Giesel, telephoned the office of the Serbian Prime Minister Pasic in order to say that he would be delivering an important communique later that day. At exactly 6 p.m., after Poincaré and Viviani had embarked from Kronstadt, Baron Giesel in Belgrade showed up at the Serbian Prime Minister's office. Pasic at that moment was away campaigning for the next upcoming election, as were several other cabinet ministers. The finance minister, Pacu, was there at the office, acting as temporary acting prime minister. And also by this time, having been forewarned that the Austrians were going to deliver an important communique, Pacu had called in the foreign minister Gruic because Gruic spoke French and Pacu did not, and that was the language of diplomacy. So Giesel, after entering, tried to deliver to Pacu a 3-page document comprising a cover letter and a list of 10 demands. He said that the Serbian government had exactly 48 hours to respond. And it seems the technical terminology was, this is a diplomatic communique with a time limit. If the Serbians refused the demands or the deadline was missed, then Austria-Hungary would break off diplomatic relations with Serbia, probably a forewarning of war. Pacu at first asked for an extension because the prime minister and other important ministers were away on the campaign trail. Baron Giesel said that that was not his problem. Pacu then refused to accept the document, saying that it was beyond his power to do so. Giesel then put it down on the table and told Pacu, "Do what you will with it." So in response, Pacu called together those ministers who were still in Belgrade, and together they read through the document. The cover letter accused the Serbian state of negligence and complicity in allowing militant Serb irredentism to flourish, and it contained the text of a notice condemning irredentism that they demanded that the Serbian government post in public places. Then after that came an ultimatum with 10 demands. The first 3 of them were calling for actions to suppress the militant movement, to condemn and ban propaganda opposing Habsburg sovereignty, or calling for the expansion of Serbia, and to end the smuggling of saboteurs and weapons over the border. Demands number 4, 6, 7, and 8 called for the arrests and prosecution of anyone possibly linked to the assassination, including specifically Tankosic and Ciganovic, whom the assassins had named as their contacts in Belgrade. Number 9 demanded explanations for statements that Serbian officials had made criticizing or condemning the Habsburg monarchy. And number 10 demanded reports on Serbian compliance with the other parts of the ultimatum. So all of these demands that I just referred to were possibly acceptable to the Serbs, and they reflected the fact that Austria-Hungary's investigation had stalled. They were caught searching through labyrinthine structures of organizations like Narodna Odbrana, and they had not managed to penetrate the Black Hand and had not linked the assassins to high-level Serbian officials. So their demands were focused on the investigation, not so much on punishing the Serbian state per se. But the kicker was demands number 5 and 6, which insisted that Serbian officials and courts would have to cooperate with Austro-Hungarian emissaries who would oversee an investigation in Belgrade, and that Austro-Hungarian officials would sit on the courts and tribunals that tried and punished the conspirators. So this would involve acceding to the authority of Austro-Hungarian officials and even Austro-Hungarian law on Serbian soil, to the point of arresting and trying Serbian citizens. This was a violation of the basic understanding of Serbian sovereignty. Although one could say that in a sense it was tit for tat. The Serbian government had claimed the authority to reunite all Serbs under their banner, including those under Habsburg rule. But regardless, it was a great slap in the face to Serbia as an ostensibly independent sovereign state. The ministers in Belgrade were stunned. They had hoped that Germany would restrain the Austrians from any excessive demands. One of them remarked in shock, quote, "We have no choice but to fight it out." Other foreign audiences also expressed shock when the ultimatum was leaked and published. For instance, Edward Grey, the foreign minister of Great Britain, called it, quote, "the most formidable document that he had ever seen addressed by one state to another that was independent." It was carefully tailored to the issue of the assassination. It made no reference to territorial claims or regime change. The Austro-Hungarians had been held back mainly by Tija, who wanted to appear reasonable. But still, it was aggressive enough that Austria-Hungary almost surely knew that Serbia could never accede to all the demands. It was, you could say, an offer they had to refuse. Meanwhile, also on July 23rd, Nikola Pašić was out campaigning for re-election, and he repeatedly refused to come back to Belgrade. In the evening, he grew tired, so he boarded a train to go to Salonika in Greece for a few days' vacation. Finally, he had to be forced by a late-night telegram from the Prince Regent to get off the train and head back to Belgrade. The next day, on the 24th, there were repeated meetings and discussions with military officers and diplomats, and they sent multiple requests for clarification from the Austro-Hungarian minister at Belgrade. They decided, after the course of this day, to give in to all of the Austro-Hungarian demands in order to avoid a catastrophic war. And Pašić penned a communique to all the Serbian diplomats abroad saying that they were acceding and giving Austria, quote, "full satisfaction." But what was happening at the same time in St. Petersburg over the course of this same day and the next? In St. Petersburg, the Russian Foreign Minister Sazonov met with the French and British ambassadors, and they agreed to take a firm line and to persuade their respective governments to back Serbia. The Russian cabinet met. The chief of the general staff argued that Russia could not remain passive if, quote, the dignity and integrity of the Serb people, brothers in blood, is under threat. He advocated for partial mobilization to prepare for possible war against only Austria-Hungary. The foreign minister Sazonov argued that Russia must stand up for Serbia or lose all prestige in the Balkans and become known as a decadent state and a second-rate power. The most forceful of all was the Minister of Agriculture, Krivoshein, who argued that Russia had been too conciliatory towards the Germanic powers, Germany and Austria-Hungary, who wished to reduce Serbia to a protectorate and to assert their dominance in the Balkans and all of Europe. And he warned that even if Russia did take a conciliatory stance, war might break out anyway. Now, it may seem odd that the Minister of Agriculture took such a radical line, but one has to remember there was extreme concern at this time about events around the Balkans cutting off the straits and stopping Russia's ability to export grain to the West. So the Minister of Agriculture, for this reason most likely, was very concerned about Russian control and rival powers in the Balkans. He then was backed up by the acting finance minister, Bark, who argued that concessions were no guarantee of peace, and so they must hold the line since, quote, the honor, dignity, and authority of Russia are at stake. And one can also see in these statements that the Russian cabinet perceived Germany as the real instigator, the sort of puppet master seeking to dominate the East, with Austria-Hungary being only a stalking horse. But at the same time, they also knew that the Tsar would not want a war against both states, Germany and Austria, at once. So ultimately, the cabinet made these resolutions. 1. Austria-Hungary should be asked to extend the time limit of the ultimatum. 2. The Serbs would be advised to withdraw their troops into the interior of the country and delay any engagement with Austria. 3. The Tsar would be asked to approve partial mobilization of Russian troops in the districts of Moscow, Kazan, Kiev, and Odessa. 4. Weapons production would be accelerated. And 5. Russian funds invested in Germany and Austria would be withdrawn. So on the morning of the 25th, the Tsar agreed to a sort of awkward partial plan based loosely on the cabinet's demands. He agreed to mobilize only the southwestern districts of the Russian Empire in order to face off only against Austria-Hungary. He also put into effect the preparatory period or pre-mobilization plan, which Russia had worked out the previous year in 1913. So by the afternoon of the 25th, artillery, cavalry, horses quickly gathered in the western cities, especially Kiev, and then immediately were dispatched towards the Austrian border. Warships were provisioned and fueled in the harbors, soldiers on furlough were called back, and final-year cadets in the military academies were promoted to officer ranks. By evening, even ordinary civilians in Russia could perceive that the empire was mobilizing for war. So what effect did all of this have back in Belgrade? Well, meanwhile, in Belgrade on the night of the 24th to the 25th, the Serbian cabinet received a flurry of telegrams from the Serbian ambassador in St. Petersburg named Miroslav Spalikovic. And these telegrams told them that the Russians would fully back them in defending Serbian sovereignty, and reported that the Russian foreign minister Sazonov had said that no state could accept the demands in the ultimatum without, quote, committing suicide. Another telegram arrived in Belgrade after 1 a.m., saying that Russia was planning to mobilize. The Tsar would soon announce that Russia was taking Serbia under its full protection. In the morning, they received messages saying that the Russian Military Council shows the greatest readiness for war and was resolved to, quote, go to any lengths in protecting Serbia. It also reported various moves, which were already clearly in preparation for mobilization, such as the promotion of the cadets. On the afternoon of the 25th, it seems the fatalist mood of the Serbian cabinet was dispelled, At 3 p.m., Prime Minister Pasic and the cabinet ordered mobilization of the Serbian army. The city guards of Belgrade were dispatched out to man the forts and redoubts around the city, and government offices began closing in order to relocate into the interior towns away from the border. They hastily composed a reply to the Austro-Hungarian ultimatum, which showed very careful equivocation on all points. On most of the demands, the Serbians agreed to comply if Austria-Hungary first showed their evidence. For example, they would condemn anti-Austrian propaganda in the press and in the schools if Austria furnished proof of said propaganda. They would give explanations for anti-Habsburg statements by Serbian officials if Austria proved that Serbian officials had actually made them. They would arrest Serbs involved in the assassination if Austria-Hungary gave proof of their involvement. And as for Tankosic and Ciganovic, they said that they had already arrested Tankosic, but they couldn't find Ciganovic. In fact, this last claim was a lie. The government had already located Ciganovic and quietly ushered him out of Belgrade. Apparently, they were afraid of him being found and questioned, probably due to what he would reveal and the evidence that that might uncover of Serbian officials' involvement in the assassination. So this carefully calibrated reply showed the delicacy of this conflict. In effect, Austria-Hungary was demanding that the licit official Serbia crack down upon the secretive, extra-legal, and expansionist Serbia, what you might call the sort of shadow Serbia, which had been undermining and sabotaging Austria-Hungary and operating across borders. But really, this request was impossible. The two Serbias were too closely intertwined, to the point of being practically inseparable. Pasic and others really had to obfuscate and obstruct because if Austria-Hungary did manage to find and finger Apis, it would show that almost all of Serbian officialdom was in some way implicated or complicit in the Black Hands terror campaign, perhaps even including Pasic himself, although we don't know. And finally, there were the two most incendiary demands, including number 5, which demanded that Austria-Hungary take part in the investigation. And the Serbians accepted this demand on the condition that the process agree with, quote, the principle of international law, with criminal procedure, and with good neighborly relations, end quote. So this was very vague and nonspecific, and apparently gave the Serbians a possible out to nix the deal in future. And then, of course, there was number 6, which demanded that Austro-Hungarians sit on the courts to try and punish perpetrators. And the Serbians rejected this outright as contrary to the Serbian constitution. So this whole reply had to be hastily handwritten in the last half hour before the deadline. Nobody wanted to go deliver it to the Austrian minister, Baron Giesel, and so Pasic went himself and handed over the document. Giesel looked it over, saw that it was not a total outright capitulation, and in response told Pasic that he would be notifying his bosses in Vienna and leaving Belgrade. All Austro-Hungarian officials in Serbia then packed up that evening and left for Vienna overnight. On July 26th to 27th, Austria-Hungary began its partial mobilization, aimed only at attacking and fighting Serbia. They waited before formally declaring war, giving Belgrade one possible last chance to back down. But more dispatches came into Belgrade from St. Petersburg through the Serbian envoy. And according to these, Russia supposedly was preparing to mobilize 1.7 million men. The Tsar intended to attack and ultimately partition Austria-Hungary, which would then pave the way for Serbia to take territory from the partitioned empire and so fulfill the nationalist quest to reunite all of Greater Serbia. Serbia held firm in rejecting the terms of the ultimatum, but their response was ambiguous, not necessarily seen by everyone as a total rejection. One could also see it, arguably, as a capitulation. For one thing, by Kaiser Wilhelm. So as all of these events were happening, what was going on in Germany? How was Germany responding? Well, as we said, many important German leaders, including the Kaiser, had been away on holiday for 2 weeks. The Kaiser was occasionally updated For instance, on the 14th, he received a letter from Franz Josef asking him for a firm commitment of support, and the Kaiser reassured Franz Josef vaguely, saying that they would use, quote, all instruments of power to prevent the emergence of an anti-Austrian Balkan League under Russian patronage. And so in this way, the Kaiser was pledging to help stop a repeat of 1912, which had been a real concern among the Austro-Hungarians. But still, the Kaiser was, you could say, a step behind. He was apparently discounting the possibility of an actual great power war involving combat with Russia directly. In the absence of the Kaiser in Berlin, the war minister and others handled affairs, most especially the Chancellor Bethmann Hollweg, who was increasingly overwhelmed by the escalating situation, and according to Admiral Tirpitz, acted, quote, like a drowning man. On July 23rd, the Foreign Secretary, Jagau, sent telegrams insisting that the Kaiser return to Berlin. After Serbia replied to the ultimatum on July 25th, officials in Berlin believed that war between Austria-Hungary and Serbia was unavoidable. The best that the Germans could try to do was try to keep Russia out, or at the very least keep France and Britain out of the war. At the same time, the German government received increasing reports of signs of the early stages of mobilization in Russia, and even in France, including among them, German intelligence had intercepted a particularly long batch of encrypted radio messages sent from the Eiffel Tower to a Russian station on the Baltic. And the German government was approaching a state of panic when on July 27th, the Kaiser finally returned to Germany. He was presented right away with a copy of Serbia's reply to the Austro-Hungarian ultimatum. He was pleasantly surprised and said, quote, this does away with any need for war. He was shocked when he was told that Austria-Hungary had already ordered partial mobilization. The next day, on July 28th, the Kaiser wrote to the German Foreign Secretary Jagau, saying that Serbia had made, quote, a capitulation of the most humiliating kind, and, quote, any reason for war has now been eliminated. The government was deeply confused. The Kaiser seemed to be scrapping their whole policy of firmness and support for Austria-Hungary. And according to the war minister, the Kaiser, quote, made confused speeches which gave the impression that he no longer wants war and is determined to avoid it, even if it means leaving Austria-Hungary in the lurch. Jagau and Bethmann never acted upon these orders because they contradicted and threw into doubt everything that they had been doing for the previous 3 weeks, and also arguably because they knew it was already too late. So in Austria, on the morning of July 28th, the Emperor Franz Josef signed a declaration of war on Serbia. That afternoon, skirmishes broke out along the river Sava. Serb troops blew up the bridge across the Sava connecting to the Austro-Hungarian town of Zemun. They were then fired upon by Austrian gunboats. In the evening, Austro-Hungarian artillery began firing shells across the river into Belgrade. Great fear as well as excitement swept through both Serbia and Austria-Hungary. And that evening, as it happened, Sigmund Freud in Vienna wrote in his journal, quote, for the first time in 30 years, I feel myself to be Austrian and feel like giving this not very hopeful empire another chance. All my libido is dedicated to Austria-Hungary. So meanwhile, how is France responding to all of this? Well, on July 25th, the same day that the Serbians gave their reply to the Austro-Hungarians, on that same day, the France, carrying the President Poincaré and the Prime Minister Viviani, stops over for the day in Sweden. The president meets with the King of Sweden and gets assurances from him that the Swedes will stay neutral in any war. He planned then to continue to stops in Norway and Denmark. But on July 27th, they receive urgent wireless messages demanding that they return to France. They are told that the Kaiser has returned from his own pleasure cruise around Norway back to Germany, and so they surmise that war seems to be imminent. And they change course, and when passing by Kiel, the German port on the Baltic, they see a German cruiser and torpedo boat setting out to sea. Viviani then starts breaking down again, and Poincaré tries cheering him up by talking to him of firmness and warning that weakness leads to disasters. On July 28th, they enter the North Sea, then reach and dock at the French port of Dunkirk. The president immediately boards a train for Paris, And en route, a diplomat asks the president if it is still possible to reach a settlement between Austria-Hungary and Serbia. And Poincaré answers, "No, there can be no settlement. There can be no arrangement." On the same day, the murder trial of Madame Caillot ends with a surprise acquittal. But beginning the next day, then, the press quickly shifts over to reporting on the mounting European crisis. The next day, back in Russia, late on July 29th, Tsar Nicholas, responding to Austria-Hungary's attack on Serbia, finally orders the general mobilization of all Russian forces from all over the empire. But before this order can go into effect, it must be signed by the ministers of the Council of War and then telegraphed out to all the various provincial capitals. At 9 p.m., everything seems ready and finalized. But at 9:20 p.m., a telegram arrives for the Tsar. It is from Kaiser Wilhelm himself, who has returned from his yachting trip and who is horrified to see how far out of hand this crisis has gotten. So the Kaiser, as we saw, had wanted to tell Austria-Hungary to back down and accept Serbia's capitulation. But his own government saw this as futile, and so instead they had persuaded Kaiser Wilhelm to contact the Tsar directly and try to defuse the situation. The two emperors, Kaiser Wilhelm and Tsar Nicholas, were distant cousins, and they considered each other friends. The telegram, and several others that followed after it, addressed the Tsar as Nicky, and the Kaiser signed off as Willy. But the content of the telegram was fairly formal, and clearly had been vetted and approved by the Foreign Ministry. Willy insists that he can act as a mediator and work out a direct understanding between Vienna and St. Petersburg. He sees this as a matter for emperors to hash out among themselves, while of course making no mention of the Serbs being in any way invited. The telegram closes with the Kaiser saying, quote, "Of course, military measures on the part of Russia, which could be looked upon by Austria as threatening, would precipitate a calamity we both wish to avoid, and jeopardize my position as mediator, which I readily accept on your appeal to my friendship and my help." End quote. So you can see here the Kaiser most fully embraces this sort of grandiose self-image as peacemaker. Now it seems this message did work for the moment. At 9:30 p.m., the Tsar issues a decree countermanding the general mobilization order, and the plan was revised back to just the partial regional mobilization of the Moscow, Kazan, Kiev, and Odessa districts. The following morning, on the 30th, the Russian cabinet was thrown into confusion, and the military commanders were in uproar. This partial mobilization would only disrupt or even ruin the carefully laid plans for a general mobilization, which were necessary in order to make an attack possible. So the foreign minister Sazonov gets an audience with the Tsar and insists that there is no chance of maintaining peace because, for one, in their view, Austria-Hungary is mobilizing too many troops just to fight Serbia, and so they must be threatening to attack Russia as well. And secondly, Austria-Hungary is being so aggressive because they are being encouraged by Germany, the real instigator. And the war with one, Austria-Hungary, means war with both powers. So this argument is perfectly underscored then by another telegram from Willy, which arrives that morning, and in which he threatens that if Russia attacks Austria-Hungary, Germany will back them. So later in the afternoon of July 30th, the Tsar sends out the order for general mobilization, and finally this is sent out across the empire at 6 p.m. And so Russia becomes the first major power to order full mobilization, and it is, as we've said, the largest fighting force in Europe, effectively making what is really a declaration of war. Meanwhile, what about the French? To go back to France, things had worked out largely as the French, it seems, had hoped. So on July 29th and 30th, the French received reports of Austria-Hungary's declaration of war on Serbia and of the Russian mobilization. According to the Russian military attaché in Paris, the French show, quote, unconcealed joy at the prospect of having the chance to exploit, as the French see it, beneficial strategic circumstances. So remember, as we said in our lecture on France, the French felt that war with Germany was inevitable, and they embraced the idea of a war starting in the Balkans, what they called the Balkan inception scenario, which they hoped would give France a chance to mobilize or even attack first from the West. Also, according to the Belgian minister in Paris, the French General Staff was favorable to war, and, quote, the General Staff desires war because in its view the moment is favorable and the time has come to make an end of it, end quote. Nonetheless, despite this reported enthusiasm, at 4 a.m. on July 30th, Poincaré, Viviani, and the French war minister sent a telegram to St. Petersburg, and it urged the Russians to hold back for the moment, to not concentrate their armies yet, and not attack first. Now, this did not work. Russia still ordered a general mobilization nonetheless. So before we talk about the Germans, what was the reason for the French to ask for restraint from Russia, despite their apparent eagerness to fight? They didn't want Russia and France to appear as the aggressors, and they wanted other nations to sympathize with them and instead see Germany as the aggressor state. And most especially, the French were in a very difficult situation, having to balance and mediate between, on the one hand, Russia, which was ready and even eager to fight, and on the other hand, Great Britain, which was much more cautious and skeptical. And France desperately wanted British support, so they had to manage the perception of this crisis in British eyes. During the last 2 days of July and the first several days of August, both the French and the Germans were anxiously looking at Britain, each side hoping to win their sympathy and support. So in Germany, the Kaiser was naturally shocked by the Russian general mobilization and the fact that the Tsar had ignored his offer of mediation. This put the Kaiser into a kind of state of frenzy. On July 31st, under extreme pressure, he agreed to declare Germany to be in SIDW, or a state of imminent danger of war, which put into motion preliminary preparations for mobilization. The Kaiser insisted on trying once again to persuade Russia to back down and reverse their mobilization. But when this fails, he regains his composure and resolve. On August 1st, Germany declares war on Russia. The Schlieffen Plan is immediately put into effect. Troops gather, and by the end of the day, advance patrols in the west are crossing over into Luxembourg in preparation for troops arriving and occupying that country, which will in turn pave the way for invasions of Belgium and France. So war with Russia and France appears to be imminent. The Kaiser is panicked. The next danger is that Britain will enter the fray as well against them in defense of France. So what did the British think about all of this? Well, of all the major powers, they have been paying the least attention, enjoying their traditional aloofness. The government and the press were totally absorbed in the wrangling over Home Rule in Ireland, which threatened to touch off civil war. The Prime Minister Asquith's surviving writings show that he made no mention of the crisis in the Balkans at all until July 24th, when he noted that, quote, Austria-Hungary made a bullying and humiliating ultimatum to Serbia, which cannot possibly accept it. He also admits, quote, we are within measurable or imaginable distance of a real Armageddon, which would dwarf the Ulster and nationalist volunteers to their true proportion. Happily, there seems to be no reason why we should be anything more than spectators, end quote. So Asquith at this point knows that most of the cabinet is firmly against getting involved in any war in Europe, and much of the Liberal Party was in fact pacifist. But at the same time, the Foreign Minister, Edward Grey, was more concerned. He has put a lot of work into building this Entente relationship with France and Russia, and he wants to stand by the informal commitments that Britain has made to them. That evening, at a cabinet meeting, they haggle over the map of Ireland and what zones should be excluded from Home Rule. But Edward Grey also proposes forming a conference of great powers, including the UK, France, Germany, and Italy, to try to mediate the conflict between Austria-Hungary and Serbia. The cabinet approves this proposal, but it quickly proves to be impossible. It's a non-starter on the international stage. As the fight in Eastern Europe escalates, with the Serbian refusal of the ultimatum, the vast majority of the British press is against intervention. Different editorials say that they see, quote, no reason for Britain to be drawn in, and, quote, no conflict of interests exists between Britain and Germany. The job of the government, in their view, is to localize the quarrel and keep Britain out of it, and no British lives should be risked, quote, for the sake of Russian hegemony of the Slav world. But as the war breaks out and expands in the last days of July, Grey insists on knowing at exactly what point Britain would have grounds to intervene. He first asks the cabinet whether, if Germany attacks France, Britain should enter in defense of their ally. The cabinet firmly says no. But after the war formally breaks out on July 28th, Grey then asks if they would intervene in defense of Belgium if the Germans invade through Belgian territory. So at a late-night meeting on July 29th, most of the British cabinet says no. Britain is a signatory to the Treaty of Neutrality protecting Belgium, but it is not their individual responsibility to protect that country. It's a collective duty. David Lloyd George says that they'll probably only pass, if the Germans do go through Belgium, they'll only pass through the southeastern corner. And even Churchill, who was usually the most hawkish member of the cabinet, says, quote, "I don't see why we should come in if they only go a little way into Belgium." But nonetheless, the cabinet does authorize Churchill to start a preliminary mobilization of the Navy. And Grey remains determined that Britain should not abandon their allies. He is certain that the ultimatum was just a pretext for Germany and Austria to start a war between the Triple Alliance and the Triple Entente, and that Germany was, quote, aiming at a political dictatorship in Europe, end quote. The next day, July 30th, the German Chancellor Bethmann Hollweg messages Grey, and Bethmann Hollweg proposes, if Germany does go to war with France, but pledges not to take any territory, would Britain agree to remain neutral? And Grey responds that this proposal, quote, cannot for a moment be entertained. But then, later in that same day, Grey talks with the German ambassador and seems to soften his position, and reportedly makes a counteroffer, saying that as long as the war remains contained to just Austria-Hungary, Serbia, and Russia, then Britain will remain neutral. But if Germany or France gets involved, then Britain will join in support of France against Germany. When the Germans receive this message, they are furious, and the Kaiser writes that the British are, quote, scoundrels and mean shopkeepers. And the Germans go on July 31st into an initial state of emergency, as we said, the SIDW. They demand that Russia halt its mobilization, or this will mean war. And late that night, the British learn of how fast Germany and Russia are hurtling towards war. So at 1:30 a.m., August 1st, the Prime Minister and Foreign Secretary Edward Grey get into a cab and rush to Buckingham Palace, where they wake up the king and ask him to approve of an urgent telegram to the Russian Tsar, imploring him to demobilize and de-escalate. The king approves of the message, only making the revisions to make it more personal by addressing the Tsar as Dear Nicky and signing off as Georgie. But regardless, on the morning of August 1st, Germany declares war on Russia. So in Berlin on that afternoon of August 1st, a message comes in from their ambassador in London. This one says that the British Foreign Secretary Edward Grey has made a further offer, saying that as long as war remains in the east and France is not attacked, then the British and the French will both stay neutral, with the French merely lining up troops along their border in a stationary defensive face-off. When the Kaiser receives this message, he is relieved and overjoyed, and he has his Foreign Office send a grateful acceptance message back to George V. So now Wilhelm believes he has finally threaded the needle and will be able to hold the line in the east while avoiding any war with France or Britain. The Kaiser then tells his military commander to hold back from any attack on France. But the military chief of staff, Helmut von Moltke the Younger, objects, saying that is impossible. We have already put the Schlieffen Plan into motion. Our troops are already beginning to cross into Luxembourg. The Kaiser says, then stop them. Moltke counters again. They need to use the railway routes through Luxembourg in order to reach France. The Kaiser says, then find another route. In his view, they have an offer at least of British neutrality, and they must not ruin it. Moltke still refuses. The two have a dramatic and emotional shouting match. Now, we may imagine some of Moltke's reasons for refusing these commands. He does not trust that the French will hold back from taking advantage and attacking their vulnerable western flank, and so he believes they must attack first and without delay. Also, the Schlieffen Plan is intricate and time-sensitive. If any part is cancelled or even delayed, the whole structure will fall, and they will stray from their timetables, thus creating chaos. So the Kaiser and Moltke fight openly, and the Kaiser apparently hits a nerve by invoking the chief's own uncle and predecessor, Helmut von Moltke the Elder, and saying, quote, "Your uncle would have given me a different answer." So on one level, it seems the Kaiser was saying that the younger Moltke was less obedient to royal authority. But also, it was probably literally true. The elder Moltke, like men of his generation from the 19th century, believed more in flexibility and responsiveness to events, where it was these 20th century Germans like Moltke the Younger who had become wedded to extreme planning and precise timetables. So Moltke finally storms out, goes home, and reportedly has a small stroke. Meanwhile, later in the same evening, another telegram comes from London. In this one, Grey seems to retract everything he had said previously. He had no authorization from the British cabinet nor from the French to offer any promise of neutrality. Instead, Grey issues warnings that if the Germans violate Belgian territory, it will be hard to restrain Britain from entering the war. But also that Britain had to keep its hands free and so could make no definite promises one way or another. So this last message throws everything into further confusion. Had Grey overstepped his brief? Was he dithering? What was Grey really up to in these messages? Historians actually still debate. Why was Grey sending these contradictory messages? And regardless, the Germans in the moment were perplexed. What were the British really thinking? What were their actual intentions? Meanwhile, in London, King George V receives the telegram that the Kaiser had dispatched several hours earlier, saying that the Germans were happy to accept this offer of British neutrality. And King George V wrote back, quote, "There must be some misunderstanding," effectively saying, "I don't know what you're talking about. We never agreed to stay neutral." So at 11 p.m. that night, the Kaiser is devastated. He summons Moltke back to the palace and sheepishly tells him, "Now you can do what you want." And so the Schlieffen Plan continues in motion. The next day, August 2nd, in Great Britain, it seems there is a mood shift. The Tory press, including the Times of London, and leading Tory MPs start expressing support for intervention due to the opposition to Germany and also to belief that the war would delay the implementation of Home Rule, which the Tories opposed more than anything. So Asquith's cabinet was still divided, but they held a long midday meeting in which Grey argues that they had led France to rely upon them for security, especially at sea, and they should not abandon them now. So the cabinet resolves that if the German fleet sails west to attack the French, then the British Navy will block them, in line with their previous informal naval agreements. They then hold another meeting in the evening, at which the cabinet decides to intervene in the war if the Germans invade Belgium. In response, 2 anti-war cabinet ministers resign. The opposition is now rapidly eroding, and even anti-war liberals know that if they bring down Asquith's government and the Tories come into power, then the Tories will probably still enter into the war anyway. Still, it seems possible that if the Germans hold back and lay off of Belgium and Luxembourg, then the British might hesitate. The anti-war party might be able to make the case that Russia was forcing Europe into war, not the Germans. But on this same day, on August 2nd, tens of thousands of German troops march into Luxembourg and approach the capital. The Grand Duchy has an army of only about 400 men. And so the Grand Duchess Marie Adélaïde and her premier order them not to fight, and the Germans occupy the country. With regard to Belgium, there is disagreement within the German War Council. Some want to just invade quickly and rush through to get to France before the Belgians have any chance to man and supply their forts. And any hesitation, in their view, will cost crucial time and lives. But civilian leaders insist on giving Belgium an ultimatum, allowing the Belgians a chance to let them pass through the country, thus avoiding giving a pretext to Britain to enter the war. So this is what happens. They give Belgium an ultimatum. They claim that they have to move west first before the French attack them. And if allowed to pass through Belgium, they would respect Belgian territory, lives, and property. They would leave once the war was over, and they would pay compensation for damages. While if denied, they would have to make war on Belgium. They then give the Belgians only 12 hours to reply. The Belgian cabinet meets that night and refuses. And the foreign minister writes to the Germans, quote, "The Belgian government, were they to accept the proposal submitted to them, would sacrifice the honor of the nation and betray at the same time their duties towards Europe." On August 3rd, this whole exchange between the Germans and the Belgians is published. A patriotic fervor sweeps first through Belgium, with all parties pledging to support the war, and then echoes through all of the Entente powers. And it presents the image of a smaller, neutral nation, definitely in no way an aggressor, standing up to the Germans, and inspires in the Entente countries a sense of moral mission and duty. So on this same day, Germany and France both declare war on one another. Belgium sends an urgent telegram to the British, making, quote, "a supreme appeal to the diplomatic intervention of Your Majesty's government to safeguard the integrity of Belgium." Later on that same day, the Prime Minister Asquith makes a speech to the House of Commons. He cites the British duty to support Belgium, as well as France, especially since the French were unprotected on the English Channel, having moved their whole fleet down to the Mediterranean, on the understanding that the British would protect them at sea on the Channel. Many in the audience in the House of Commons consider this speech very powerful and the best of Asquith's career. Even an anti-war Liberal MP named Addison says that the speech, quote, "satisfied, I think, all the House, with perhaps 3 or 4 exceptions, that we were compelled to participate." Later that evening, the Foreign Secretary, Gray, famously said to a journalist, quote, "The lamps are going out all over Europe. We shall not see them lit again in our lifetime." The following day, on August 4th, the British sent a final warning to Germany to respect Belgian neutrality. The Germans refused, and instead Germany declared war on Belgium, and in response Britain declared war on Germany. The rest, you could say, was just formalities. On August 6th, Austria-Hungary declares war on Russia, and Serbia declares on Germany. On August 12th, Britain and France both declare war on Austria-Hungary. So by the middle of August, all of the major powers of Europe, Britain, France, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Russia, as well as many of their smaller allies and satellites, including Serbia and Belgium, are all at war with one another in a massive continent-wide war, with combat breaking out in multiple theaters, both in the East and the West. By this point, only secondary powers, such as Sweden, Italy, and the Ottoman Empire, remain neutral. And the immediate question, asked even at the time, of course, was why? How did all of this happen? Was there some greater reason for it? And this is the question I hope to return to and consider in a final lecture, which will conclude the series, revisiting this question of causes and addressing the question, was the First World War inevitable? So thank you for listening, and thank you again to the letter T, and to all of my current active patrons whose names begin with T. Tammy DeWale, Tasha Folsoy, Taz Sibley, Ted Yu, Thaddeus Pera, Theus Says, Thomas Boyle, Tiffany, Tim Volker, Timu, T-Mart, Tony O, Tori Petty, and Trent McNamara. Thank you.